So another video response to Vince Venturella's topic of the week. This time, what is fantasy as a genre? Basic open discussion about fantasy, and really, is it part of sci-fi? What defines the fantasy setting? I think really what defines fantasy as a whole is the idea that it is something very. It's very fictional. I think you could wipe a broad brush across everything and say that fantasy is anything that is not going to or is not real, and that's kind of bad because we already have the word for that. That would be fiction. And there's a lot of things that happen in fantasy that could happen in real life: betrayal, comedy, romance, action and adventure, or whatnot. But I think the biggest thing is that there's a lot of elements for fantasy that aren't physically possible in the real world. For the most part, we don't have elves or orcs in our modern day-to-day where we have to either combat with or talk with people that we don't physically understand, or combat with something that is a common threat to us other than the usual responses of eating, the usual day-to-day challenges for us. But I think fantasy also inquires things that have a lot of mainstream building to them. The biggest example I can think of right now is Harry Potter. That's a very it can take place in a mainstream. It's taking place in a mainstream setting, but it's a very fantasy-based world. Outside of that mainstream, the wizards try to keep away from all of the muggles or all of the humans. And I think if you really want to go into the deepest recesses of fantasy, you would go to Alice in Wonderland, where nothing ever really makes sense in that world. She's trying to get from one place to the other, and nobody ever gives her anything. They're always too busy about tea party or whatever the queen wants. A fantasy setting as a whole really takes us out of our day-to-day life, and my fiance described that as being mainstream, something that would happen in natural life. A fantasy setting takes us out of something that is normal. For example, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. They enter a wardrobe and appear in a completely new world. Other things such as I'm going to go with Doctor Who. He's always sometimes he'll go into the past, but he's almost always going to some other foreign place and trying to help people out. And it's taking us out of this mainstream, what we see on a normal day-to-day basis that really defines the fantasy genre. If we want to talk about stories that have and we can talk about genre, but we can also talk about elements of fantasy. For example, things that normally wouldn't happen to us, like take for example a mystery novel in which somebody's robbed something, they've gone to track down and find the thieves, only to stumble across more mysteries. And at the very end, they're like, okay, we caught the thieves, he's the actual criminal, but what about this other thing? Why exactly were we able to capture this criminal, or some other fantastical element that leaves the viewer thinking, well, did they actually get the reader thinking, well, did they actually get the right guy? Was there something more going on to the story than that? Something that we don't know and we can't really explain. I think fantasy also grasps that and really embraces we can't explain what's going on, so we're not going to try to explain what's going on. You just have to say, well, that was pretty fantastic, and I'm going to live with it. And so then we get into kind of what is the difference between fantasy and sci-fi. And I think a lot of times, or I think the general description that fantasy is a part of science fiction is horribly wrong, because science fiction is very separate from fantasy. Science fiction tries to explain everything that happens. The biggest issue with science fiction is that they're usually moving into the future, and they may be moving backwards in the past, but they generally get some kind of they use their imagination and the fantastical elements to design what is a possible future that they use a lot more mainstream than fantasy does. They try to design what a future would look like for humanity, usually going forward in time. And where that kind of breaks with fantasy is that fantasy doesn't care about how we got to. It's another take on that we never got, or that we're never looking at how we got from point A to point B in fantasy, but in science fiction we really are focusing on how we get from point A to point B. A lot of stories in science fiction have to do with dystopia, utopia, how horrible the future is going to be, how terrible the future is going to be, how are humans going to be able to overcome the challenges of the future. And kind of looking back as well, I think Back to the Future is probably a very good example of a science fiction story. So just tying how sci-fi tends to tie in with mainstream. Back to the Future tends to be is a science fiction movie, but has a lot of mainstream elements. But it's all set in the real world, which actually makes it not fantasy at all. Although we would wish, hey, we could travel back in time and whatnot. Because science fiction tries to set itself in a place in time that is probably in the mainstream world, it can end up being both right and wrong in later on in the future or as events develop. For example, we're not in Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 where people are coming to burn books all the time. And while there's that, we're also not in a utopian civilization. And like I mentioned with Back to the Future, the Cubs won the World Series the year after it was set in Back to the Future. They didn't know that there was going to be, or they thought there was going to be a Jaws 19. It turns out what you can make your own inferences onto what they may have been thinking, but it turns out they may have been thinking that, people are going to like the 3D films and sequels over and over every year. But there's also things that they couldn't predict. For example, there's a Texaco station that features prominently, and most people don't know that a lot of Texaco stations got turned into Shell stations, and Texaco as a brand actually got bought by Chevron. So the likelihood of a Texaco station being in Hill Valley in what might be a quaint or might be a very distinguished part of town, in all likelihood that probably isn't a Texaco station anymore. But science fiction really treads into the fantasy territory when we start introducing new races that we as humans have only know of the civilized race known as humans. We've never met any of the other civilized race from like Doctor Who, the Daleks, the Cybermen, and a few of the others. We haven't met any of these new races, or we haven't met any new races, and that's really something that falls into fantasy. Although science fiction can always justify that considering how massively vast the universe is, at some point or another, we're going to have to run into somebody else, since we can't be the only statistical anomaly throughout the whole universe. Or maybe we can. But based on that little bit, introduction to multiple races, and races tend to follow the same tropes. Humans don't see them tend to categorize them as one stereotype or another that goes for everybody in the race. They can't be they can't be both they can't be orcish in nature and elfish in nature. They're either one or the other. So I guess what defines fantasy would probably be anything that's not Earth at the period in time that the story is taking place at. Anything that's a little bit different from it probably is closer to mainstream. For example, if we had 2 tongues instead of 1, or had 3 eyes instead of 2, that might be closer to mainstream, because we would all, for the most part, get up in the morning, go to work, come back home, eat dinner, and probably go to bed. Maybe a few other hobby things and a few social interactions in between. But where you start getting into fantasies, when you start introducing things that aren't real or aren't likely. Science fiction, on the other hand, tends to talk about, well, how exactly did we get from point A to point B, whereas fantasy goes, just roll with it. You should be enjoying. Roll with it if you're enjoying what's going on right now. So hopefully that's kind of covered everything I think I can talk about on this topic of the week. My fiance was really helpful in this because she actually reads books, which I should probably start doing. But then you got to talk to other people, and sometimes they haven't read the books. Forget it. I'm going to stick to playing video games. So I'm Andrew. If you like the video, like it. If you want to hear more ramblings, which I'm hoping to do in the future, subscribe. If you didn't like the video, comment and tell me why you didn't like the video. And go ahead and hit the do not like if you don't like it. But hopefully hopefully this gives you a better opinion for yourself on what fantasy really is to you.